Good evening, bonsoir tout le monde. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for participating. This webinar is one in a series of public information events that the QCGN puts on to help English-speaking Quebecers understand their language rights and the impact of federal and provincial legislation on those rights. This evening's topic is Bill 96, an act respecting French, the official and common language of Quebec. The Quebec government says the bill is aimed at updating and strengthening the Charter of the French language, Bill 101. The QCGN believes that this bill has deeper implications. We are deeply concerned with the government's use, once again, of notwithstanding clauses to override Quebecers' fundamental rights and freedoms. We shared our views on Bill 96 in another webinar last fall, and we encourage you to read our legal analysis of it on our website. Opposition to Bill 96 is not confined to the QCGN or to the English-speaking community. During the public consultations, the National Assembly's Committee on Culture and Education heard concerns from human rights and business groups. There are signs that opposition to Bill 96 is growing. So tonight, we have invited two distinguished guests to discuss this bill and the public's reactions to it. And I'm particularly pleased to note that they're both journalists. My former colleague, the Honorable André Pratte, is perhaps best known as one of Quebec's most respected commentators and authors. For most of his career, he worked at La Presse, where he was editorial page editor from 2001 to 2015, one of the best jobs in the world, and was a member of the management team. In 2016, André was called to the Senate, where he sat as an independent senator, and he served with great distinction until choosing to retire from the Senate in 2019. He's now a principal with the firm Navigator. In addition to his journalism, André has written several books on history, the media, and politics, including a biography of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. He has spent years reflecting on the great issues of our time, and I'm delighted to say that he has resumed writing thought-provoking newspaper columns. Christopher Curtis is an award-winning journalist who worked for the Montreal Gazette for 9 years before he left to launch The Rover, a media company that, and I'm quoting here, tells stories the government doesn't want you to read, end of quote.
Kind of makes me sound crazy. I promise you.
Makes you sound like a real journalist. And as that description suggests, Chris is a frank and fearless investigative journalist and definitely not bound by conventional wisdom. So let's get going. We'll start by giving each of our guests 5 minutes to tell us what they think of Bill 96 and what it means for Quebec's future. And Chris, could you please lead off?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if it'll be 5 minutes. I'm hoping it'll be shorter.
Short is good.
Yeah. To begin with, I think we should all at least agree that preserving and promoting the French language in Quebec is essential. And I think we play a part in it as Anglophones, whether we're historic or fictional or whatever. We do need to play a part in it. And I think there is often a kind of a reflex to maybe assert ourselves in a way that doesn't consider the precarious position of French in North America. And we should really start off, I think, acknowledging that. And that Bill 101 and that the intentions behind Bill 96 are we have to acknowledge those, and we have to realize that French is the thing, language is what contains who we are and our values and our culture, and it ties us to a time and a place. Now, does Bill 96 really fix any of the major problems or the major threats to the French language in North America? I don't think so. Like a lot of things that this government does, it strikes me as more political than anything else. And the problem that we run into with 96 is, is it even enforceable? There's a lot of stick and not a lot of carrot. And whether it's warrantless searches of people's work phones or computers, whether it's fines that could put a business out of business. These might play well with the CAC's base. I know that before the hearings on Bill 96, there was something like 77% of francophones polled support Bill 96. But if we start looking at the minutia of the bill, it's a lot of stuff that looks good in a column, that looks good on paper. But the big obstacle is there are new arrivals every year. That's just the reality of life in a globalized economy. And how do we accommodate? How do we make sure that these people learn and speak French? Now, there's another problem that we add on to this, and it's how do we measure the decline of French in Quebec? It's an important thing to track, and we need to keep our eyes on it. But if we're going at mother tongue or language spoken at home, that I don't know that we ever get those numbers back to where they were. If you come from another country and you hold on to certain languages and traditions, which is absolutely your right, you might not speak it at home. You might speak it in public, and I think that's the most important thing, that it's the language we speak in public, that it's a culture we engage with in public. But how do we incentivize that? Now, Bill 96 is passing something really tough like that is easy, and it works, and it plays to the CAC's very effective strategy. Maybe I'm a dreamer, but I would like to see something more like a summit on the future of French, not only in Quebec, but French in Canada, because, in the prairies, in Ontario, across the country, French is experiencing struggles. It's in decline, and we need to be good neighbors, and we need to figure out how to preserve that and how to keep that life in there. And I think a summit where you would bring together, creative people, artists, not just introduce punitive measures, but encourage people to learn and live in French, and it's something I've been trying to do more and more in journalism is trying to improve my French. And darn it, it's really hard and it's really frustrating, and you make a lot of mistakes. But I think that if we focus on incentivizing rather than punishing, then we're working towards a solution. Unfortunately, that's not how politics seem to work in this province a lot of the times. But those are essentially my thoughts on Bill 96. I'm sorry for rambling.
It's not a rant, and it's certainly concise, which leaves more time for questions in due course. Mais entre-temps, André Pratte.
Thank you, Joan. So first, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for inviting me. It's an honor to be here amongst you virtually. Just a warning to begin. I want to highlight the fact that even though I'm a proud French-speaking Quebecer whose family arrived here more than 300 years ago, and some of my parents and grandparents played a significant role in promoting and preserving the French language in the province, my opinion on this matter is by no means representative of that of the majority of French-speaking Quebecers. By opposing both Bills 21 and 96, I am clearly, for the moment at least, in a minority. After 40 years of reporting and commenting on Quebec politics and policy, I'm absolutely convinced that because of its minority status in North America, the French language needs legislative protection in the province. I think a few of the measures in Bill 96 could be helpful in that regard, proposing necessary updates to the Charte de la langue française to take into account the current language situation. I'm thinking, for instance, of the creation of this new administrative structure called Francisation Québec, where all the efforts to help newcomers learn French will be concentrated. The province has never done a good job at francisation, even though all governments have been saying it's a priority. So perhaps this one-stop shop will help. Bill 96, as you know, is a large bill containing a vast series of amendments to the Charte de la langue française and other acts. The QCGN's legal analysis, or at least the summary that I've seen, does a much better job at describing these numerous amendments than I could ever do. But I'll tell you what I find the most worrisome. It is, as Joan mentioned, the use of the most wide-ranging notwithstanding clause in Quebec's and Canada's history. What does that mean? It means that the great majority of Quebecers' fundamental rights, all Quebecers' fundamental rights, are pushed aside to make way for this legislation. Now, as you know, some Quebecers believe that the Canadian Charter is illegitimate and that Quebec has the right to bypass it. Okay, but what about the Quebec Charter? Bill 96 is protected against any claim based on the first 38 clauses of the Quebec Charter, adopted unanimously by the National Assembly of Quebec in 1975, a charter that once was an object of pride in the province. Justice Blanchard of the Quebec Superior Court, in his decision regarding Bill 21, and this applies to Bill 96, strongly criticized such the use of the notwithstanding clause. But of course, the clause ties the court's hands unless the Supreme Court finds a way of invalidating Bill 21 and Bill 96, which would cause a major political problem. But this is not our topic today. As far as the Canadian Charter, as you surely remember, Mr. Trudeau Sr. accepted to enshrine the notwithstanding clause because it was the only way to get the support of the provinces for his patriation plan. Besides, he and others believed that the political cost of using the clause would be so great that few provincial governments would dare use it. And this appeared to be true up until now. But Bill 21 in 96 show the real risks of the notwithstanding clause when the majority of the population of a province is either indifferent to the suppression of minority rights, or even worse, in favor of it. The door is then open to legal discrimination against minorities, and that's exactly what is happening with Bills 21 and 96. Now, just as an aside, you might find interesting to know that when the Quebec Charter was adopted, that's nearly 50 years ago, the Parti Québécois was opposed to the notwithstanding clause. They thought that it would be too easy for governments to avoid their fundamental rights responsibilities. It was Mr. Bourassa's government, a liberal government, that insisted on including the clause in the Quebec Charter. And this decision is now coming back to haunt us. Bill 96 calls all of this souveraineté parlementaire, but in fact, it is the power of the majority to impose its will on minorities, even if it involves those minorities' fundamental rights. It is René Lévesque who said, a society will be judged by how it treats its minorities. I fear for history's judgments of Quebec after the passing of Bill 21, well, this is done already, and Bill 96, which obviously and unfortunately will pass too. We will have a chance to discuss the specific measures contained in Bill 96, but what I find particularly troubling is the attempt to eliminate English from the public space. The bill's philosophy is that English must not be seen anywhere, in particular within the provincial administration. For example, one clause encourages public officials, when they're dealing with a newcomer who does not speak French, to use their mother tongue instead of English, even if the person speaks perfect English. The Code Civil is amended so that documents that could be provided in French or English will now need to be available in French only. Other provisions will have as an effect to discourage the government and private companies from requiring knowledge of English when hiring. And the word English is never mentioned in the bill. It's always another language. We all know what the other language is, of course. This will lead to fewer Quebecers learning English. And how will that help Quebec's development and economy in today's globalized world? And there are several provisions that encourage the learning of French by Anglophones and Allophones, and that's fine. But what about providing French-speaking Quebecers the opportunity to learn English? I'm close to closing, Joan. I look at
No,
I
it's
see your
fine.
worried eyes.
You're doing well.
The other worrisome trend in Bill 96 is the establishment of a huge bureaucracy with the powerful Minister of the French language, the Office de la langue française with expanded powers, and the Commission de la langue française. Departments and government agencies and private companies as small as 25 employees. This means thousands of companies will have to fill out reports, send them to the minister, who will analyze the said reports, comment, order changes, etc. What a waste of time and energy. And to what end? Finally, the unilateral change in the Canadian Constitution. That is troubling here, I know, because of the content of the amendments per se, but also because of the way this is done. I mean, Quebec has said for years and years and years that Ottawa and other provinces should not change the Constitution without their agreement. And now here they are changing the Constitution without consulting anybody. And whether it's legally correct doesn't really matter. Politically, it is not. It is not right. Now, infringing on Quebecers' fundamental rights, eliminating English from the Quebec's public space, bureaucratization of the protection of French, unilateral changes to the Constitution. That is, in a few words, what Bill 96 does. This is not the right way to protect and promote the French language in Quebec. I know some media have succeeded in creating the myth that French was in serious danger in the province now, and that strong legislative action was required at this particular juncture. Let's not fool ourselves. It will be very difficult to move the needle of public opinion on this matter. Not impossible, but difficult, especially since most liberal politicians, and I'm using liberal in the philosophical sense of the word, of course, since most liberal politicians stay silent for fear of displeasing the French-speaking majority. This makes this episode, Bills 21 and 96 combined, a very sad period for Quebec's liberal democracy. Hopefully, this is not a precedent for further erosions to fundamental rights in the province. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I went a bit over 5 minutes.
Maybe, but Chris had gone so much under 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Well, no, I mean, yes, one of us was a senator and one of us has been kicked out of several bars in Ottawa. I think, I'd rather hear from the senator.
I really thank you both. You both made really important points. I think it's worth stressing that English-speaking Quebecers, by and large, and certainly Chris, you made this point, agree that it is important to preserve and promote the French language in Quebec. And it's important that we, as English-speaking Quebecers, be part of that. I liked Chris's line that we have to be good neighbors. We have to be good neighbors. That's not just within Quebec, but across Canada. We have to be good neighbors to our Francophone fellow citizens. And I thought that was a really important point. However, as you also observed, this bill contains an awful lot of stick and not much carrot. André Pratte said, and I personally strongly agree on this point, that the most worrisome element of Bill 96 and indeed Bill 21 is the use of the notwithstanding clauses. I don't think there's been nearly enough attention paid to that. But André also made some other rather devastating points about this bill, that its goal is the elimination of English from the public space, that it contains a huge expansion of the bureaucracy, that it contains a unilateral constitutional amendment based on no consultation, as you said, André, with anybody at all, so far as we can tell. There are obviously many technical details to the bill which need to be discussed, and we certainly don't have time for it all tonight. But I did want to ask you both a couple of questions before we turn it over to our longstanding patient public. Let me begin with one that has had a lot of attention in the English-speaking community. Can any government define a historic Anglophone? What does that mean anyway in 2022? Is it a reasonable way to determine who can receive services from the Quebec government in English? Who wants to go first? Okay, André, you're on the screen, so you get to go first.
How am I on the screen?
Maybe your chair squeak.
Yes, well, no, I don't think it can really be defined. I mean, I know the Premier defined it, I think, by people who satisfied Bill 101's education rights clause. but that doesn't make much sense because, I mean, this would limit the English-speaking community to a very small portion of what this community
Yeah.
really is and represents. But I mean, in a way, it makes sense that they do this because, as I said, the the purpose of the bill, as they won't say it publicly, but if you read the bill, that's what it is to reduce the space for English in Quebec to, eliminate maybe a strong word that I used, but I mean, it is to reduce the space that English takes in, for instance, public administration, to the smallest extent possible, while being able to say, well, we respect the historic community, but that's it. And the same thing for colleges and CEGEP, for instance, where they limit the growth of these institutions to, so that they never grow again. In a way, that's what the purpose is. So I'm not surprised that they try to limit the community to what they call the historic or the Bill 101 measures, but I find it very worrisome. And I think you touched upon a point, Joan, that many of the issues raised by the bill have not really been discussed in public. And if they were, I'm confident that public opinion would change a little bit. I'm not sure to what extent, but I think it would. I think French-speaking Quebecers have no idea of what's really in the bill, and all the different measures in the bill that really do not respect what the role, the historic role, but the present role of the Anglophone community and how diversified it is. And it's strange because these points that we're making right now on the Anglophone community in Quebec are exactly the points that are raised by French-speaking minorities outside Quebec, that their position, their place cannot be limited to simply people who speak French, but also to immigrants who come and speak French. They are part of that community also. It's a very, again, it's a very bureaucratic way of looking at it. And I'll stop there. I'm sorry. There's
Chris, how does it
so
feel?
much to say.
Chris, how does it feel to be or not to be a historic Anglophone?
Well, funnily enough, if had I not gone to English high school, my daughter wouldn't be a historic Anglophone. She would just be, her last name would be Curtis and whatever. And she wouldn't have access to certain services and that, but that doesn't really matter because my daughter is, will speak French and English. We live in a very bilingual community. That's not a problem for me. My fear is for people. My fear is twofold. Uh, the one is our healthcare system, and I worry about elderly people who maybe, or who don't have a mastery of the French language and whose health is starting to fail. I have an uncle with schizophrenia, and it's very difficult to get through to someone who might be in crisis, and if you can't have access to services in your language, then the hospital can be a really scary place, and it's already a scary place if you have schizophrenia. The other sort of fear that I have is the court system, and we have I believe 98 or 99 on average in the 2000s, 98% of the time a judge will sign a warrant that the police give you an affidavit and the judge will just sign off on it, listen to people, go to someone's home, whatever. We have a judiciary system that really errs on the side of the state. Now, if you take away people's right to defend themselves, or or at least if you limit their right to have access to justice in their own language, whether it's through the criminal system or the civil system, I think you're creating a dangerous situation. You're creating a situation where someone might end up in the system, someone might cop to a plea deal and get a criminal record, and once you're in that system, it eats you alive. And if there's something we know about Quebec's prison system, and then maybe I'm going off on a crazy tangent, but I think this is very important. When you end up in prison in this, you have a higher chance of committing suicide than any other province in Canada. it limits your opportunities in life. And so my two big kind of, if you want to call them sacred cows, are healthcare and the court system. Schooling and that sort of thing. I think children are adaptable. I think children can, but these are two parts of our society that address really vulnerable people. And what's upsetting, and we'll probably address this later, but what's upsetting is this entire conversation is one colonial power speaking to another, and none of it involves protecting indigenous languages. None of it considers the fact that, like, we're having all of this argument over basically stolen land and it really erased cultures. So those are kind of some of the thoughts that come to mind with this whole, silly as it is, that historic Anglophone ended up to all these other areas, but these are things that I just keep kind of replaying in my head.
Okay, good answers, both of you. Let me move to another question, which concerns both Bill 96 and Bill 21. These are arguably moves by the National Assembly. Wait a second, my computer's acting up.
We can hear you.
Okay. Can you hear
Yeah.
me? Good.
Yes.
These are arguably moves by the National Assembly to extend its authority to the, quote, territory of Quebec, rather than the jurisdictions that are allocated to it under the Constitution. An example, Bill 96 would seem to apply to federally regulated businesses. Another example, Bill 21 applies to all peace officers who exercise their functions mainly in Quebec. That sounds as if it would include military police, the RCMP. So, are these bills really about secularism for Bill 21 and the French language for Bill 96? Or is something else going on here? Who wants to? You're on the screen. Go for it.
There's the law and there's what you can get away with, and how does the law apply, and how could is it even conceivable that you could enforce this on a federal government? Well, I maybe this federal government, they seem to be scared to death of Quebec, so possibly. But my fear with this is that, when it comes to any kind of a conflict with Quebec, Ottawa kind of shirks away and doesn't assert itself. And this isn't a question of being anti-Quebec or Quebec bashing. This is a question of your constitutional powers and responsibilities. Now, I don't begrudge any movement or state or people. I don't begrudge anyone their right to independence and their right to self-determination. But we're not there yet. Like, we can't just rewrite the Constitution. Don't get me wrong. We have a very strange Constitution because it has, there's a big whoopsie doopsie button where you can almost do whatever you want. So why even have a Constitution that has an escape hatch? But there still are certain constitutional protections that you can never get around, separation of powers and that sort of thing. And it's more, it's more smoke and mirrors. It's more, it's more important to look as though you're having a fight with Ottawa than to actually protect the French language. What does it really matter, whether you can walk into a federally regulated business and tell them how to do business? If that's not possible, then why even say it? Well, you're saying it because it looks good to fight with Ottawa. Like, it looks like we're a combative people. We like fights and we like to assert ourselves with Ottawa, and that's fine. But this is a government that, we talk a lot about Bill 96 and Bill 21 and look, the last week of the last federal election was derailed because of a poorly phrased question about Bill 96, where everybody came cowering and apologizing to Quebec. And I don't, you either have a country or you don't, you either, and don't get me wrong, like if one day 50% plus one of Quebecers decide to form, a nation, I won't get in anyone's way, fine. But that's not the reality yet. You can't just improvise your way to a country. And this is a government that does that a lot, and that kind of has to backtrack. This government, for all its popularity, this government has backtracked many, many a times on faulty legislation. And I just fear that this is part of the larger, had Ottawa not vocally opposed Bill 21, maybe they would have walked it back a little bit. But it's very strange to me that I think a lot of smart and maybe even kind people in this government know what they're doing won't work, or know what they're doing is technically wrong, and they might even know what they're doing is morally wrong, but it's popular. And the job of any, unless you're a senator, the job of any politician is winning elections. And yeah, sure, you're going to win an election, but it's another one of those cases where this is a government that seems to be all tactics and no strategy. There's no, what is the long-term goal? I mean, are we really going to improve the lives of children, by putting blinders on them and you'll never see a hijab and there are no Muslims? I don't know. I don't think it's a particularly useful approach to the thing. I mean, give me a few beers, I can go on about this for 3 or 4 hours, but
okay, but now I want André to get a chance to answer this. André, is
something else going on?
What is going on here? Are we talking about smoke and mirrors, as Chris suggested, for the sake of short-term political impact? Is it a more profound change? What's happening?
Yeah, well, I think there is an attempt by the government of Quebec for political reasons and possibly ideological reasons to occupy fields that up until now were seen as a federal jurisdiction. I mean, we talked earlier about amending the Constitution. I mean, this is a new idea, which personally offends me as a proud Canadian and a proud Quebecer. And the federal government said, oh yeah, okay, it's okay, they can do it. Well, of course, I mean, if the federal government does not react to changing the Constitution unilaterally by a province, then they'll do it. I mean, the provinces, the Quebec will try to occupy all the territory that it can. As far as Bill 96, the language provisions, as you know, they're one of the myths in this debate is that a huge problem for French is federally regulated companies, right? But it has been demonstrated by very rigorous studies that, well, number one, many of these companies, banks and so on, already have their certificat de francisation, so they're not a problem. Several of these companies are under the Official Languages Act, Air Canada, CN, huge employees in Quebec, but where an employee who speaks French has the right to speak his language because he's in Montreal and he's protected by the Official Languages Act. So what remains is, as federally regulated companies, is a tiny portion of the workforce in Quebec. It's less than 1%. So, I mean, they're doing all this for less than 1%. But of course, the federal government said, oh, not only can they do it, we'll do it for them. We'll put it in our legislation on language, that federally regulated companies, it's not said like they need to respect Bill 101, but they're doing it for the provincial government. So yeah, this is a nationalist government. They're as Chris said, it's popular in Quebec when you can confront the federal government, and when it's the federal government that backs down all the time, well, it's easy political points to score, and they can now from now on say, hey, I mean, we have put Quebec, the nation of Quebec, inside the Canadian Constitution. No government before us did it. Great. So yeah, they're occupying the territory that is ceded to them.
Let me ask about this now repeated use of the notwithstanding clauses. André, you said, and I'm afraid it's true, that an awful lot of people, and particularly French-speaking Quebecers, don't even realize that the notwithstanding clauses are there, or if they do, what it means. But two questions, really. A, if they did understand what was being done, would they mind? And following on from that, are we looking at a reversion to pre-charter visions of what good governance is? The notion of parliamentary supremacy above all.
Yeah, well, I think on the second point, Joan, I mean, the government has said that, and it's in Bill 96, right? The supremacy of
Yeah,
Parliament.
but for everything, or just
Yeah,
for Bill
well,
96?
well, yes, but it's a precedent. It's their philosophy that
Yeah.
Parliament, or the National Assembly in this case, should be supreme, right? And as I said earlier, the idea behind Mr. Trudeau Sr. Accepting the notwithstanding clause, and it's been said by Romano and others, they were convinced that it would not be used very often because it would be too politically costly. And up until now, it proved relatively true. I mean, when the Ontario government tried to do it, to use the notwithstanding clause for municipal elections, there was a lot of controversy. And when Mr. Bourassa used it many years ago, there was again a lot of controversy, and that may be what killed the Meech Lake Accord. But in this particular case, public opinion appears to be indifferent, or even more troubling, in favor of this happening. I am confident that if people really understood what's going on, they would be at least uncomfortable with that. I'm struck by the fact, for instance, Joan, and I'm not sure how people saw this, but during the hearings by the National Assembly Committee that heard the different witnesses on Bill 96 and, in fact, Bill 21, the media coverage was not really that important, right? There are many, La Commission des droits de la personne went there to deplore what was happening, and there was nothing in the newspapers about that. And so, I mean, with that, such an important piece of legislation, with such a wide-ranging use of the notwithstanding clause, and that there is so little interest by the media for these fundamental aspects of the bill, it strikes me as irresponsible by the media. Now, in the case of Bill 21, the fact that there was a case recently where a teacher was suspended or changed jobs because of Bill 21 of the law, and we've seen since then that support for the legislation has gone down a little bit. So maybe that means that when people realize concretely what can happen, maybe support for the legislation will go down. And a final point I'd like to make is I think what happens when these bills come to the Supreme Court is extremely important. In our history, the Supreme Court has often saved us from ourselves, right? I mean, they were the padlock law and so on. So in this particular, and we also know that Quebecers have a lot of respect for the courts, including the Supreme Court. So what will happen if the court finds a way, even with the notwithstanding clause? As you know, there are ideas as to how that could happen. What happens if these bills are deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court? How will Quebecers react? I think it will have an impact on them. Many of them may be angry, but I think many of them will take pause and maybe realize that something is going on that is very serious here.
Chris, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, what strikes me, and this is, I think, across the world right now, is the idea of a democratic norm versus something that's been written into the law. You know, as André was saying earlier, I hope it's okay. I just call you André. As André was saying earlier, the idea with the notwithstanding clause is it would be so politically costly, no one would ever use it. But what we're learning more and more in modern, I mean, look south of the border, right? No one ever thought a president would do this, and then a president would do that, and then and I, you know, increasingly it feels like whatever is popular, whatever polls well. I mean, remember, this is a government that likes polls, governs by poll practically, and it feels an awful lot like norms don't really matter. What can I do or what can I get away with is what matters. And that's something that we have to take a look at, I mean, across North America, but in Quebec very seriously, and in Canada very seriously. How do we codify some of these behaviors that we consider norms so that, you know, so that rights aren't trampled on? And that's extremely important. And then, I mean, also to speak to André's point, which I was thinking of as well, like you see the human cost of Bill 21. A qualified, well-liked teacher loses her job or has to be shifted to some other job where she can't teach. And suddenly, you know, and of course, more recently, you know, parents, because our school system and our health system is collapsing, volunteer parents can come teach at schools. You can have a hijab, it doesn't matter, unless you're qualified and want to get paid to teach, in which case you can't. That, to me, the way that you change like, and what I've learned in journalism and is you can't just hit someone over the head with facts. You can't just kind of choke them until they realize, like, oh, well, this is what the law says, and this is what's right, and this is what's wrong. You have to appeal to someone's humanity, and you have to say, look, this person who chooses to wear a hijab, who might not be like you, is a lot more like you than you think. And this person cares about your kids. And this person, you know, went to school and studied how to help people with Down syndrome. This person is a lovely person. Do you want this person not to be in your child's life? Do you want this person to be marginalized from a very important part of our society simply because you might have a misunderstanding about how their religion works or how religion works in general? You know, there's a much larger conversation about rights and secularism and all of the underlying problems of a changing world that I think a lot of people in Quebec and across North America are having a hard time kind of gauging. And that's probably why we see a lot of these populist bills and populist politics kind of emerging across the globe. I think we would gain a lot more by engaging with some of these issues that are causing us fear. Remember CAC beyond the language stuff is anti-immigration. CAC is has said some very strong things about Muslims. You had a CAC minister recently who blamed Omicron on a half dozen people entering Canada through Roxham Road. That to me is kind of what's looming in the background, and that's what gives me pause, and that's what scares me, is that we do look at this kind of supremacy of Parliament, and we are, I think, increasingly ideologically aligning ourselves with countries like France, where rights don't really mean anything if you're in a minority. And so all of this rambling is to say I'm really worried, but I'm also really optimistic that when you appeal to someone's humanity, not when you yell at them, not when you tell them you're stupid, not when you tell them you're wrong or you're racist, but when you appeal to the goodness in them, because there are a lot of people in this government I wouldn't have a beer with, but I'm sure that if I had a flat tire by the side of the road, most of them would stop and help me. If you look into that part of a person's soul, you can get that person. A lot of the time you can go and you can get that person. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't get up in the morning, and I would do a lot more drugs than I currently do.
No.
Comments on.
This is a family occasion. But thank you. Serious points. André, I want to ask you something about what contributes to the decision to adopt something like Bill 21 or Bill 96. One of the things that is a source of chronic frustration to many English-speaking Quebecers is the persistence of old myths. The belief that Anglophones are still in a dominant position, earning more. How many people know that the poverty rate is half again as high among Anglophones in Quebec as it is among Francophones? Not many people know that or are willing to internalize it if you tell it to them. So is something like Bill 96 a function of the overhanging influence of all those old myths, some of which are based on things that were true in the past? I'm not disputing that, but times have changed. Or to what extent is something like Bill 96 and Bill 21 based on the kind of thing that I think Chris was alluding to, which you see across the Western world, and not just now, but it's a natural, seems to be a natural human characteristic, that you want everybody to be just like me, that you feel comfortable if society has to be made uniform, or at least comes to be uniform, and if it takes the law to nudge it along, so much the better. So which of those influences would you think predominates here now?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, and not necessarily the same balance for each bills. But if we talk about Bill 96, I mean, for obvious reasons, Francophones in Quebec have always been concerned about the future of their language and how, and I mean, after Bill 101, this certainly calmed down a bit, and well, it calmed down considerably, and French-speaking Quebecers became more confident to control their economy, and so on, and all that happened. I think the origins of Bill 96 is the media, and especially a few media's campaign to convince Quebecers that French was in danger. Not only in danger as it's always been because we're a few million people in a huge continent speaking English and Spanish and Chinese, but also because the facts, you, for instance, the idea that you can't be served in French in certain areas of Montreal, and the use of statistics, that as Chris alluded to, that using the mother tongue, French used to be 81%, it's now 78.6%, and that's seen as a huge indication, a credible indication of danger. And so all these modern myths, I would call them, have been very strategically and skillfully implanted in people's minds over the last couple of years. And I think that's the origin of Bill 96. I mean, when the CAC was elected, the polls clearly showed that a huge majority of French-speaking Quebecers were convinced that French was going back. That things were going very badly for the French language in Quebec, and so the CAC government, as Chris said, they have their finger on the pulse of French-speaking Quebecers. They saw that and they asked their officials, we want a huge bill on language, put everything that can be found and put it in the bill so that we can tell people that we're doing the maximum that we can do. And that's how you get this mammoth bill of all sorts of measures, which I think the huge majority of which will not change one iota to what the situation of French in Quebec, but will infringe Quebecers, fundamental rights, and not only Anglophone fundamental rights, but all Quebecers' fundamental rights. And so I think the mechanics for both bills is a bit different, Joan. And so since we're on Bill 96, I think that's really the fear that's been instilled in people, that French is the share of French-speaking Quebecers is going down in the province, even though I think the facts and the statistics don't really show that at all.
Thanks. Let me come back to Chris's line about not many carrots, lots of stick in this bill. Chris, what would you recommend as carrots, given that we all agree that it is necessary and important to preserve and promote the French language, first of all in Quebec, but also across Canada, and that legislation is one of the tools that will probably be needed forever to achieve that goal. But what can we do in the way of carrots, or what should we do in the way of carrots?
Well, if money was unlimited, that's a problem too. It's that the major measures that you would need cost a lot, and they're logistically kind of complicated to But I mean, the big thing is obviously access to francisation, access to courses either for free or even they pay you to take them. It might not sound, might be a bit of a hard sell, but that's one aspect of it. But what irks me about all of this is that for a lot of Canadians, this is the only news they get about Quebec is, you know, they're coming at us with this law or that law. And there is, and it sounds silly and stereotypical, but there is like really a joie de vivre here, and there is that it is a fun place to live, and there is something different and wonderful and magical about the French language, specifically how we speak the French language with whether it's joie in Quebec or chiac in New Brunswick, and we have some of the most creative and I mean, we just have wonderful artists, and why aren't we using that? Why are we hitting people over the head when we could be saying like, go buy Lisa LeBlanc's album? It's a wonderful. It's first of all, it's an insanely good country album. Like even if you don't like country music, you like this album. Secondly, it's bilingual. There's singing in both languages. You have they're the Dead Obies, which rap in both languages. You have a nice we have this artistic, young, vibrant community of people who really just want to go and discover the other, and I would loop indigenous languages into this. You know, you have a ton of really exciting indigenous creators out there. Why aren't we using this? Why aren't we appealing to these people? Why aren't we coming up with some sort of a summit? Because I would much rather want to learn French, you know, like I would much rather French be presented as the joyous, fun, wonderful thing it is than to feel like it's homework, you know? I mean, there are so many descriptive words and ways of expressing yourself in Quebec French that we need to. Anyways,
Okay.
I'm in love with it, and I could speak about it forever, and I'm sorry for going on too much.
Listen, those of us who have chosen to stay here had reasons for doing so. Now, I've just been handed a batch of questions from the audience, and we don't have much time. So I'm going to pick one that kind of interests me. Has to do with the CEGEP question and limiting access to English schools and whatnot. And the question is, shouldn't there be pushback from students whose ability to attend post-secondary institutions in English is being curtailed? Students normally are willing to hit the streets about almost anything. André, what do you know about that? Or what can you hypothesize?
Yeah, I'm surprised it did not happen or hasn't happened yet, because I remember a few years ago there was the idea of imposing Bill 101 on CEGEP was put forward during a Parti Québécois convention, and the young Parti Québécois activists were against it. And one of them said, listen, I'm from Chicoutimi, and the only opportunity that I will have to learn English is to come to Montreal and go to Dawson College or whatever, because that's the only opportunity I have to learn English. And so I'm surprised that young people do not challenge this, especially since, and I want to just maybe surf a bit on what Chris has said about culture and young culture in Quebec. Uh, I mean, young Francophone Quebecers have a totally different experience of the language and religious landscape in Quebec than older Quebecers have, right? And that is, I think, an indication or a sign that things there may be signs for hope in the future, because young Quebecers are not afraid of English, of the English language. They want to learn it because they know that they want to travel the world. They want to be able to work anywhere in the world. And the same for religious signs. I mean, they've been to school with people from all sorts of cultures and religions, and they have friends. An experience that is so different from the ones that their parents and especially their grandparents had. So I'm confident that these young people, or I'm hopeful that these young people will react and challenge these pieces of legislation once they understand what's in them. But the problem is, of course, for many young people, all these things about politics and so on, they don't really care about. They care about the environment and things of this nature, and I understand why. So yeah, I think this issue of I mean, it is for many young French-speaking Quebecers the only opportunity to learn English, and that's why English colleges. That's one of the reasons English colleges are so popular. And what's striking Bill 96 is that they do that, but they do nothing to improve the opportunities for French-speaking Quebecers to learn English.
We're running out of time, but there's another question from the public that I really would like to put to you, and I'll give you 2 minutes to answer it. We're losing rights under these bills. How do we get them back? Small question, just a not at all profound question, right? No, it's really important. How do we get them back?
You mobilize and you organize. I mean, you need to enlist allies. If it's just the Anglophone community, there's only so much noise that can be made. It has to feel like like it is a grassroots effort. It can't feel like some kind of conspiracy between Anglos, Ottawa, and the ghost of General Wolfe. It really has to feel like it's organic. And I mean, it's Quebec. We know how to mobilize and organize. And I think that's ultimately the only way is mobilize, organize, and make people pay a political price, because that seems to be the only thing this government understands is politics.
So in order to mobilize and organize beyond the English-speaking community, you have to find allies. And doesn't that come back to what you said about being a good neighbor?
Exactly.
In the end?
Help your neighbors get their car out of the muck and shovel their driveways. But no, I think being engaged with Francophones, having Francophone friends, making sure that, like, maybe you listen to a podcast or you watch a TV show or whatever it is, but having some common ground and not only ever engaging with Francophones when it's a fight over rights, but, maybe you're going to a Led Zeppelin tribute concert or whatever, and then a Loco Locast show or whatever. But, that's it. Be a good neighbor, be a good ally, be there in the fight when they need you, and hopefully the same will happen when you need them.
Yeah, takes time, but maybe many good things take time. Look, I want to thank you both so much. This has been just such a stimulating session, and I hope that the audience got as much from it as I certainly have done. I want to thank you both enormously. You've made excellent points about fundamental conditions affecting the French language and culture and French speakers, but also affecting the English language and culture and English speakers and all Quebecers. I think that's perhaps the ultimate point here, that we're talking about all Quebecers ultimately. I want to thank, therefore, Chris Curtis and the Honorable André Pratte formally for agreeing to join us for this QCGN webinar. And I want to thank all the people who have attended. We're so glad to have you. You've been here in great numbers, and we appreciate it enormously. Stay tuned, not this evening, but stay tuned in general. The QCGN is concerned with these issues and will continue to be active and to engage the community in discussion of them. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, André. Thanks for your service to the country, and thanks everyone for listening.